Episode 17 rewinds just a bit and opens on Ruby's scroll, dropped near the door to the announcer's booth when she made her charge on the energy field around the arena. We can see this is when Yang was trying to call her, and thus why Ruby didn't pick up. We jump down to the sidelines of the battlefield where Ruby is in absolute shock over Penny's death, and on the opposite side of the arena are John, Nora, and Ren, who are more aware and able to react to a Nevermore trying to peck its way through the force field at the top of the arena. Pyrrha is of course devastated by what she did, and now that we've established a bit of the friendship between her and Penny, it becomes even more tragic. Also on the scene is Ciel, who has run onto the field and is now cradling Penny's head, mumbling apologies to her about not being a better friend, leaving some implied wiggle room for her and Penny's dynamic and what could have gone on between them while they were off screen. John hops the barrier just as the Nevermore breaks through, and he, Pyrrha, and Ciel are sent sprawling when it lands. Ruby, snapped out of her daze, rushes in to save them, stabbing the Nevermore with Penny's blade. During this we see Ciel scrambling for her scroll. The Nevermore takes off and circles around for a second attack, only to be impaled by dozens of lockers, more than what was even in the original volume. From behind Ruby and Pyrrha, they hear Ciel yell at the Nevermore, shaking her scroll with the words "Military Override" displayed prominently on it. All of the lockers open, and while most of them are other people's weapons, all of Juniper's weapons are accounted for, as well as the weapons for Scarlet and Sage, who walk onto the field from the stands to join the growing number of huntsmen. This is quickly followed by 10 more lockers slamming into the Nevermore, revealing weapons from Team Auburn, Team Indigo, Flint Cole, and Neon Cat. Ciel pulls her own weapon from a locker, a simple Pyrrha-esque handgun with a star-shaped brass knuckle replacing the trigger guard. It's a cute little reference to Jill Valentine from Resident Evil, which Ciel's outfit and appearance seems to mimic. The group organize on the back of the Nevermore, and just as Sage goes in to execute it and make sure it's dead, it gets up, resulting in the functional huntsmen in training, i.e. not Ruby or Pyrrha, pulling together and using their teamwork to behead it, with Sage getting the kill shot. Pyrrha apologizes to both Ruby and Ciel, broken over having killed Penny, and balks at her being a robot. Ruby, knowing this was a setup, assuages her guilt and tries to be positive that Penny could be rebuilt. Ciel, however, puts a damp towel on that idea, holding up a chunky black box that's been sheared in two. She mumbles that she'd suspected what Penny was, given some of the things Ironwood and Penny had talked about, but she never really gave it much thought. After swallowing what seems like guilt, again going back to that brief characterization before the Nevermore showed up, she remarks that she thinks that this box is Penny's hard drive, and if that's the case, the real her may be completely unsalvageable. Before anyone else can say anything, Ciel stands and reverently pockets the hard drive's remains, boldly proclaiming that she's taking it back to Atlas with her and she'll find a way to bring Penny back. The others watching this seem to share similar resolution with her words, and John walks up to Pyrrha. He points out that the attack, the accident, and the broadcast were too well timed to be coincidental. That Ash Autumn woman had to have been involved. He hands Pyrrha her weapons and briefly rests his hands on her shoulders for support. Ruby mentions Emerald 2 and by proxy Mercury, having pieced together that they must have been manipulating the fights from the start of the tournament. Reese walks up and asks, "Well, what do we do now?" just as a flank of griffins arrive on top of the arena. Ruby calls to John for his scroll, which she uses to call in her locker, though with a more complicated input sequence than just pressing a single button. Seriously, that was pretty lazy, animators. From here, things play out relatively the same. The locker arrives, they circle up to fight the griffins, Port and Oobleck arrive to help them escape, and the students run off. From there we get the scenes of civilians and students alike evacuating the arena, with the caveat that there are small smatterings of huntsmen and students who are watching the doors and standing at the ready to protect the fleeing masses. You don't even need to give them complicated weapons. Broomsticks and the like would work fine. Since, you know, some weird Atletian chick kinda called in a whole swath of random lockers, leaving dozens of innocent students unable to arm themselves for a hefty chunk of time. Ciel's locker barrage was effective, not necessarily mortal. We get Ironwood being badass, his speech to the students agreeing to take a ship down the beacon, and Roman playing around on the flagship. With Roman, he proceeds to infect the entire Atlas system with the Queen virus, taking control of all the robots and turning them evil. A slight change here, Crow and Glinda aren't down in Vale. Instead, both of them are escorting Alspin to the docks with the goal of traveling up to the arena to fetch Pyrrha. We join them just as they're reaching the cliffs overlooking Vale, where they receive a call from Port, who informs them that Pyrrha, along with their other students still at the arena, have been instructed to evacuate and have seemingly left. Crow groans about having wasted time, saying, "I could have just flown up there myself to find her," just as the robots turn on them. They catch the three off guard and shoot Glinda off the cliff. Osmond tells Crow to follow after her, that he can find Pyrrha by himself. Crow kills a few robots and nods, jumping off the cliff after Glinda. Back with Ironwood, his robots turn on him and take down his ship, which prompts Ruby to leave the evacuation transport the arena crew is on in order to ride a rocket up to the Atlas flagship. Both she and her locker land on the ship, with the locker causing substantial amounts of damage to the hull with its impact. It's the alert about the damaged vital systems that get Torchwick's attention, and he sends Neo to check it out. We cut to Weiss, who is chasing after Blake. Blake has made it even farther ahead, having dived into a whole squad of White Fang to cleave their way through them. Weiss tries to catch her breath while in a throng of Atlassian robots that are fighting the same White Fang that Blake is. This is when the turn happens, and Weiss's reflexes are the only thing keeping her from getting 3 rifle shots to the face. She finds herself on the back foot, unable to follow Blake and forced to fight the robots. Blake then makes it to the cafeteria where she at first is adamant to confront Adam, but as soon as she catches sight of him, her composure begins to crash. Especially when he sees her and begins to talk to her with the eerie line of, "Well, darling, it's good to see you again." We cut and get a pan to show the arena group made it to Beacon and are now engaging Grim on the ground level. It eventually sweeps to Cinder and her flunkies, streaming the events to keep the chaos and unrest going through multiple kingdoms. At Mountain Glen, we get the Wyvern breaking free from the mountain, awakened by the large scale of spreading destruction. Its entrance is felt across the battlefield, and it should be noted the Wyvern still spawns Grim. However, instead of coming out fully armored, they're quote-unquote newborns that lack the typical bone plating. They're easier to take down, but there's such a vast quantity of them being produced that they're pretty effective as a swarm. It swoops over Vale, smashing the CCT, destroying it as well as causing catastrophic levels of damage to the surrounding city. We get a brief cutaway to Mercury and Emerald streaming into the chaos, becoming confused as the stream becomes local only. They turn to see the still collapsing tower, to which Mercury says, "Oh, that's a bummer," and ending the stream overall. The last scene of the episode has Ozpin finding Pyrrha on the Beacon campus. Pyrrha goes with him willingly. John tells Ren and Nora to keep fighting while he goes to find out what's going on, and Cinder, from a distance, sees the 3 leaving the battlefield. Her eyes glow, and the episode ends. The opening of episode 18 is pretty much one for one the opening of the original episode 11, with RWBY running into Neo, Roman learning about RWBY's presence and rushing to help, and Blake encountering Adam. The only small tweak is Adam saying, "my love." I get it, the guy owns a trilby. Can we maybe tone it down to something a little bit less cringe and maybe a little more genuine? Maybe sweetie? I don't know, if I were in charge of this, I would work with the voice actor to see what sounded the most natural. My love just sounds too awkward as is. We jump to Yang with Team Bronze, and while she's running with them, she also sees Blake running across the campus in the opposite direction. She directs the vacuuming team to keep moving towards Beacon's courtyard because then has a straight shot to the docks. They ask where she is going, and she responds that she needs to save a friend. Bronze yells after her, "Isn't that what you told us not to do?" with incredible frustration, but he doesn't receive a reply. Back in Beacon's courtyard, we have a united front amongst Team Auburn's Indigo, Neon Flint, Nora, Ren, Sun, Neptune, and Weiss fighting the jumbled forces of the White Fang, the Grim, and the rogue Atlassian military tech. The battle is waning, with the assembled students beginning to really falter after such a prolonged combat. A few of them, Nora and Ren included, keep getting battered around by both alphas and paladins. Nadir has his shoulder crushed by a Grim and is about to be killed when Team Bronze, Sans Roy, swoops in for the save. This alleviates some of the pressure on the other fighters, but it's only a little bit. Eventually they're pushed back towards retreating, but during a frontal assault on the Paladin, Sun is pushed aside by Neptune, who is impaled through the back by the Paladin in his stead. It slams him into the ground and he stops moving completely, implying that he's been killed. Sun has his legs stamped on to hold him in place and is about to be impaled as well when Weiss has her moment of heroic inspiration, willingly throwing herself in front of the blade to save Sun. She unwittingly summons the Armored Knight's arm and cuts the Paladin in half. Sun doesn't have time to react, rushing to Neptune's side, noting that Neptune is still breathing but it's shallow. Weiss starts instructing everyone to retreat, and that's when the next Paladin rounds the corner, this one looking a little more kitted out than all the others. What was the deal with that one anyway? Why was it so special? Why did he get all the cool gadgets? Like, it was never explained. It just seemed kinda out of place to me. So the RWBY v Torchwick and Neo fight is perfect. I don't care what anyone says, this is gold and everything about it is staying in. Every line, every hit, every little motion. Even Roman's blasé response to the Grim overrunning Vale still makes sense because he doesn't know Cinder's real plan, but he does know that she's a very real threat and crossing her would end with him and Neo dying. Still, the results are the same. Neo is flung off by RWBY's quick thinking, Roman bests RWBY overall, Roman is eaten, and RWBY accidentally crashes the airship by kicking the same Grim through the hull. Thank God for leg day, am I right, RWBY? From there, she recoil hops down from the ship on Crescent Rose. We get the scene with the invasion spreading into Vale, with Crow and Glinda holding back the early waves of Grim that are making their way into the city, as well as the robots positioned around town that have turned on the general populace. Ironwood gets his next big hero moment, Crow gets one of his own by saving Ironwood from a griffin, and we watch the flagship crash, which takes out all the robots across the city. A small side note, Cardin was in the original version of this scene, but instead we're swapping him for CL to imply that at the very least some people have started making their way down from Beacon and the arena to Vale. We cut back to the courtyard combatants and find them about to be run down by the Super Paladin, only for it to go offline with the Restia Legion robots. Cutting again, man, there's a lot of cuts in this last quarter of the season. There's so many moving parts going at once.
It's so dense, every single image has so many things going on.
We find Pyrrha, John, and Ozpin arriving at Amber's pod, and this scene is practically unchanged. Pyrrha gets in the second pod, thereby submitting to what she thinks is destiny, John stands guard, and Ozpin follows the IKEA manual Ironwood left behind on what pre-buttons he needs to press. Jump to Blake, where she's unable to overpower Adam, who just knocks her to the floor and monologues about how he's going to deliver justice upon the humans as well as destroy everything Blake loves. This will start, of course, with Yang, who has just wandered onto the scene by punching a random White Fang mook. Back to Ozpin, John, and Pyrrha, Oz activates the machine after having Pyrrha state her acceptance verbally, and John is alarmed to hear Pyrrha in pain when the machine kicks in. He does, however, maintain his own composure and continues standing guard, despite Pyrrha's cries. This does little good though, because he's taken off his feet by a single arrow, allowing a second to whiz right into Amber's heart. Cinder has arrived, and she's accomplished the next step of her goal. Back to Blake, who has just been stabbed in the stomach by Adam to lure Yang into the room. As Blake begs for Yang to stop, too quiet to be heard from her wound, Yang charges and yeah, that result is what you think it is. At the same time, Amber's power almost completely transfers to Cinder, leaving only a dismal glow around Pyrrha, which should clue us in that she's kept some small fraction of the power that has touched her soul. John and Pyrrha try to fight Cinder, but Ozpin stops them and instructs them to escape and bring back the rest of the Yellow Brick bunch, namely Crow, Ironwood, and Glinda. Cinder, being smart, tries to kill them, but this is the first time we get a glimpse of Ozpin's power as he zips across the entire room in the blink of an eye to shield the children. Pyrrha and John escape. With Blake one last time, she throws herself in front of Yang, and Adam goes in for the kill, only for Blake to use her semblance to get her and Yang out of harm's way and on their way to escaping. Adam just follows after them silently, walking as he casually kills a Grim. Hopping back to Ozpin, he's staring down Cinder, who comments on where he stored the maiden, commenting on his arrogance. Of course, this had been told to her by Salem, but Salem is still currently relegated to the vague pronoun stage for villainy, so her mention is only enough to let on there's a bigger fish in the pond. The scene fades out as both of them ready to come to blows. The last two episodes, 19 and 20, are all one big joint episode, and not too much really changes. There's the fight between Ozpin and Cinder where we can assume Ozpin dies, and we get the mandatory evacuation of all personnel from Beacon's Cliff after the situation is deemed untenable. There are just some small tweaks here to show characters like Velvin, Cardin, Neptune being loaded onto the evacuation ships along with the bulk sum of their teams, giving us a little more continuity at the end of this. RWBY makes it to the docks and is alarmed to find so many of her friends in terrible condition, namely Blake and Yang, the latter of which is still unconscious. When it's noted Pyrrha and John are still missing, she immediately wants to set out to find them, and Weiss volunteers to go as well, telling Sun, Nora, and Ren to take care of Blake and Yang while they're gone. We jump to Pyrrha and John outside of Beacon's main spire, the heart of the campus with Ozpin's office and the vault. John is searching his phone to call Glinda, still confused by everything going on, when Cinder comes rocketing up the elevator shaft and leaps up to Ozpin's office. Pyrrha, seeing this, makes the fatal decision to stay and try and defeat Cinder. She tells John to leave and get help, to get to safety, but John refuses. She silences him with a kiss, which leaves John stunned and Pyrrha more adamant. She apologizes as she flings him into a locker that crashed nearby and sends him off to Vale, him begging the entire time for her to stop. I know this is word for word what happened in the original scene, but I've been glancing over a lot in this particular recap, and I thought a moment this poignant needed to be spelled out, because this is the moment that Pyrrha actually dies. This is the completion of her character arc. If she succeeds, she rejects the desire for a normal life as a huntress and accepts her supposed destiny to be a fall maiden. And if she fails, she's saved from the pressure of knowing there was something greater. She could have done something more to protect the world. There was only one choice she had, and she rejected it, sent it away in a locker with her hopes and dreams along with it. Safe to say, it isn't Pyrrha Nikos that steps into the broken elevator and magnetizes it to the top of the tower. With RWBY and Weiss, they're approaching the heart of the campus without much of a sense of where to look when they receive a call from John, who has opened a joint call with Nora and Glinda. He's landed in Vale and quickly explains where Pyrrha is going and what she intends to do, begging them, anyone, to save her. Glinda and Weiss try to get more out of him, but in his frustration and grief he chucks his scroll, breaking it. RWBY and Weiss look up at the tower, which now has the Wyvern clinging to it, and appraise the horde of Grimm around the building, most of which have spawned from said Wyvern. RWBY proclaims that she has a plan, to which remarks that she always does, leading the two charging into the thick of things. The Wyvern meanwhile has climbed to the top of the tower where Cinder welcomes it home. Pyrrha comes out swinging from the elevator, but Cinder is ready for her, matching her tit for tat. During this fight, Pyrrha is able to keep up with Cinder, though only barely, and astute viewers will see a small speckle of gold around her skin, hinting that there's still a small amount of that maiden power within her from the transfer initiation. She's still not really a match for Cinder despite all her skill, with her sword breaking and getting thrown around when the Wyvern destroys the top of the tower. She uses the rubble to attack Cinder, but that backfires, ending with her aura breaking. Around this time, RWBY and Weiss finally make it to the base of the tower, where Weiss uses her glyphs to allow RWBY to sprint up the wall. Pyrrha makes one last desperate throw with her shield, and Cinder uses her glass weaponry to outsmart the attack, with her arrow breaking apart around the shield and coming out the other side. This, however, still changes the trajectory of the arrow, and the arrow lands in Pyrrha's heel instead of in her chest like intended. Cinder walks around her, taunts her about being promised the power, and finally Pyrrha asks the damning question if Cinder believes in destiny. Cinder says, "I do," before lining up the shot on Pyrrha's heart. RWBY reaches the top of the tower just as the arrow is loosed and watches as Cinder absorbs the remaining mating power from Pyrrha. The gold glow goes into Cinder, while Pyrrha's ashes go the other direction and scatter to the wind. As the camera pans out from RWBY's eyes, witnessing the events, we get flashes from across the last 3 seasons, all the moments RWBY shared with Pyrrha, moments good and bad that nevertheless end up becoming fond memories for RWBY. This gives us a clue, though not a very detailed one, on how Silver Eyes work, as RWBY envelops the whole top story in pure white light. Cinder, the Wyvern, and herself are absorbed and the screen fades completely. We hear Crow rescuing RWBY. Crow and Ty talk about local communication still being down and how bad the whole situation is overall. RWBY wakes up and talks with her dad, who explains she's been unconscious through the whole summer after the fall, and he's just happy to see her awake. RWBY is visibly gaunt, and when she moves, there's a tremble to her motion, her muscles having atrophied some during her coma. He updates her on what's happening at Beacon. She did a number on the Wyvern, but it's not dead, frozen on the tower and still attracting more Grim to its presence. RWBY asks what she did to the Wyvern, clearly not quite remembering using Silver Eyes, and her dad dodges the question. Crow pops in and asks for a minute with RWBY, which she gets. They share a brief pleasantry before he mentions what she did, and again she pushes to know what she, in fact, did. He asks what she remembers, and she recounts what happened up until the Silver Eyes kicked in, realizing that Pyrrha is dead and Cinder was responsible. When Crow goes on to describe the Silver Eyes, he doesn't open with, "What did Ozpin ask you?" He instead makes an assumption based on something Ozpin might say. It's a slight tweak, but it treats Crow as observant and not clairvoyant, as he kinda came off in the original. I mean, was he there when Ozpin was speaking to RWBY? Did Ozpin tell him in explicit detail how he opens conversations with random people? Crow elaborates about the legends about silver-eyed warriors, and we're even given a name drop to the Reaper as someone with the supposed gift, a figure both Crow and RWBY are fans of, so we can get a good uncle-niece connection. RWBY is unsure about Crow's seduction, but he points out that the Wyvern is frozen and she's fine and dandy at home. When he's questioned on his knowledge of things, he confides that he's been working for Ozpin for years, taking stints off his job as a teacher to fulfill different missions around the world. Now that Oz is gone, he's going to have to pick up the slack. RWBY wants to help, but Crow tells her to rest, though he definitely drops the fact that Cinder's trail leads to Haven, giving tacit permission for RWBY to pursue the case. RWBY goes on wobbly legs to Yang's room, where she's still recovering herself, though that's not really the best word, as Yang is starting to enter a depressive spiral. She laments the loss of Beacon, of Penny, and of Pyrrha. She explains that Weiss's father came and picked her up, since the last thing anyone on the outside of Vale saw was the White Fang attacking, Grim invading the city, and at Legion forces turning on the populace. So Weiss is back in Atlas now. Yang is even more sore over Blake, who ran to who knows where after the ambulance ship landed in Vale. When RWBY tries to make sense of this, Yang shuts her down, saying that sometimes bad things just happen. RWBY asks what they do now, and Yang opts to lie there while RWBY can do whatever she wants. She then asks to be left alone when RWBY goes to comfort her. RWBY says, "I love you," before leaving. We get one last shot of a depressed Yang before we follow a single leaf as it falls to the ground, leaving only a pile of leaves in shot. We pull up from those leaves to find ourselves at Summer's gravestone with RWBY, who is just silently staring at it, apparently lost in thought. She talks to her mother, asking questions about what's going to happen, about where her friends are, about what the Silver Eyes are, about all the horrible things that happened, lost to the world and even humoring Tortrick's dying, pessimistic words. We see clips of Beacon overrun, Weiss on her way home with her dad, Blake fleeing into the streets of Vale, Yang watching a raven outside of her window, Glinda struggling to reconstruct a storefront, of a hospital housing Velvet Fox, Carden Sky, and Neptune, the latter of which is now bound to a wheelchair. We jump back to RWBY as she finishes mulling over these thoughts. She says she wants to do something because so many people are in pain, but she doesn't know what she can do without hurting any more people. She implores her mother for help, and yet the answer never comes. The camera pans back to show her on the cliff, staring at the grave. We get a super cut of time passing, with Ruby out on Summer's cliff seemingly every day for the next few months, staring at it solemnly as the seasons change. Now standing in the snow, John, Ren, and Nora approach her, asking if she's sure she's ready. After all, she only just recently finished therapy for her atrophy a few days prior. She nods, and all four reaffirm their desire to go to Haven and track down answers. They begin to leave, and Ruby shoots one more glance back at Summer's grave, giving us a shot mirroring the first shot we had of Ruby this entire series. The camera pans up to the sun overhead, where the moon was in the original short, where a flock of birds form Monty's signature. The credits roll, and we get the after credits scene with Crow following the newly formed Team Ranger as a bird. Cut, print, season, done. There we have it, Volume 3 fixed. Honestly, this wasn't quite as insufferable as Volume 2's fixing, but it still caused its own mesh of troubles. After this, I've gotten a new appreciation for writers that can effectively handle tournaments, especially ones that on the surface don't seem to have any overarching plot. I mean, the biggest pain was the fact that the canon Volume 3 had almost no actual thread to justify its tournament beyond Penny dying. And even then, the justification behind that was a complete mess because it undermines the entire panic the plan was designed to instill. So what I can say is that there was a skeleton of a plot, but it lacked any sort of calcium, and the meat that was packed around it lacked any kind of protein. Hopefully now I've given the volume the proper nutrients to make it nice and healthy so it can stand on its own. There are still things I feel I didn't quite touch on enough, such as the mass casualties caused by the fall of Beacon and the Cardinal Coffee subplot, which, unlike my previous fix scenes, didn't have quite as much room to breathe. There were also points where I was a little hamstrung by current events, namely in regards to Coffee and Neptune. I had the idea to kill off both Fox and Neptune this volume, a send-off since they'd not appeared in the show since, but of course my ideas were dashed the minute after the fall was announced and Neptune made a surprise cameo at the start of Volume 6. And a fun little cameo at that. So I needed to change gears, and instead I spread out some of the suffering to more scars and wounds than anything else. And in the end, I still hit all the major points I wanted to with the Cardinal Coffee subplot, it was just the bare minimum of them. And there are a lot of scars and wounds. RWBY goes from being at the top of their game to absolutely broken by the end of this. Yang's PTSD, Wise's loss of freedom, Blake's shaking faith in both herself and her team, and RWBY questioning every idea she's espoused so far in the face of the horrible atrocities. This is to say nothing of Team Juniper, who are equally as gutted with the issues that are carrying over into Season 4, with hints at Nora and Ren's origins, Nora's unresolved spat with Pyrrha, and John dealing with, well, frankly a lot. There was more I wanted to do with the villains this time around, especially since this was the first time their active plans have been the real motivator behind the story, but I ultimately felt leaving them as enigmas served more of a purpose. We only really learned some of their origins, and even then, a lot of the big ones didn't get much of the screen time. Poor Torchwick really needed more time to shine. Adam too, though he's got a whole arc planned for him in the future. The only one I'm actually concerned about at this rate is Cinder, since her motivation is going to be integral to the story, and there are any number of ways Rooster Teeth could still screw me over with it. If they don't come up with something good, I may go with something of my own, but for now, she's still a relatively blank slate aside from the few hints we've been given. Neo's going to be more fun to play with though. Oh, do I have plans for her. Even with my slight disappointments, I'm overall satisfied by what I managed to fix here, especially when it came to playing into Pyrrha's tragedy. I can't wait to start exploring the repercussions of that going forward. When you have a main character die, you really want it to stick, you know? Make it worth the investment for the viewers. And hopefully, if I've done my job right, this time sink has been a proper investment for you. A friendly reminder that I couldn't do this at all without my lovely patrons, each of which have supported me through thick and thin. I'd like to give a loving and special welcome to the newest batch. Turd Ferguson, Animal of the Elements, Andrew Bircher, Jimmy Patel, and Inquisitor Thomas. I'm sorry this video took so long, there's a lot to cover and I hope you can see that. Reminder that $1 or more to my Patreon gets you access to the Team Frostbite Discord server where Fatman, Tom Horan of Six Slick Productions, and myself are regular participants, as well as other fan favorites such as Mediocrity, the Floof Artist, and the always amazing Dashi Lee. Come join us guys, it's a real blast, we would love to have you there. Otherwise, if you want to support the channel but don't want to pay a dime, you can subscribe, click that bell, and make sure you have notifications active on your profile. This will let you see when all of my content pops up on the channel. If you're still not receiving updates because YouTube's algorithm is pretty bad these days, feel free to follow me on Twitter at RWBY. There, I regularly update about my most recent uploads as well as what I'm working on next. Special thanks go to FamtanFalling, Mediocrity4, and the wonderful Dashi Lee for their support and ideas, as well as to Moderately Entertained, who still maintains the Adding Flavor to Remnant spreadsheets anyone can access to help develop new ideas and concepts for this revised setting for RWBY. A huge shout out goes to the Sketchy Huntsmen, who are a newly formed art group that brought you all the wonderful original art presented throughout this entire series. I look forward to having them on board for the future, and if you want to join them, keep an eye on my Twitter, as I'll put out a call for more artists when Volume 4 starts getting underway. And one more shout out to Carlos Destare for the wonderful cover art he does for all of these videos. As with all previous parts, I'll be doing a response video to address some of the criticisms, complaints, and ideas presented in the comments, so please don't forget to leave your own thoughts down below. New to the Fixing series, I'll actually be planning on doing the next one of these as a live stream, and we'll see how that turns out. It might be a more recurring thing in the future. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope to see you in my next video. Until then, catch you on the flip side.
A fire burns brightest before it flickers and fades.
And those trapped in its heat will either be consumed or survive to resist even the greatest of blazes.
I face such a crucible as my life is torn apart by misfortune and mistake.
Only time will tell if I am turned to ash.
Or if I become something, forged within flame.